We're continuing our conversation about staff notation and pitch by talking now about octave numbers or octave designation. Now, if you're in a rehearsal and someone says, hey, play a C, do they mean this one, or this one, or this one, or this one? Sometimes it's hard to tell. And so in music, we actually have both letters and numbers that identify pitches. We've talked about the letters and how those work. Now let's talk about the numbers. This is referred to as the treble staff when it's in that particular place. But its other name is the G clef, or more specifically, the G4 clef, because the note that it circles is G4. This is referred to as the F clef or the F3 clef because the note that it identifies is F3. Now, what does that mean? Well, quite simply, the lowest C on a piano is 1. And every time we get to a new C, we add a number. And so if we start at this C, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, those are all 1. C1, D1, E1, and so on. When we get to a new C, then we add a number. So this would be C1, but up here, an octave higher, it would be C2. So what does that look like on the staff? Well, if middle C is right here, we talked about before that that is the same pitch, that and that are both this, the same number. So middle C, which is C4, and we think about from C all the way up to B is the same octave. So here, that right there is 1 octave. That is the 4 octave because it's the 4th C on the piano. We're using the piano as our point of reference here. So if that's the 4th C, then anything higher than that would be the next one. So this C all the way up to that B is going to be my 5th octave, C5. So we've got C4, D4, E4, F4, G4, A4, B4, C5, D5, E5, F5, G5, A5, B5, that would be C6. And that would go up an octave. And then all the way to, I can't draw all the ledger lines, so I'm going to write the symbol that we use in music, which is 8VA, which means octave above. I'm going to go ahead and write it to where you can see it. 8VA, octave above. And that it literally means ottava alto, but it translates to English just fine, octave above. So that is actually going to be C7, and so on and so forth until we get to C8. It's really high and doesn't really sound very good from anything. If we go back, now we're going down in numbers. So if that's C4, right here, the B right below it would be B3. So from C here to B here, that's our 3rd octave. And this B right below that to this C right there, that's our octave number 2. Now I could draw a bunch of ledger lines here as well, but why don't I just, instead of octave above, all right, 8VB, octave below, ottava basso. And so if this is C2, now this is C1, the lowest C on the piano. Now, pianists might be saying, but wait a second, C isn't the lowest note on the piano. What happens to that A and the B flat and the B that are right below it? They're zero. This is A0, B flat 0, and B0. And then we get to C1. And then the highest note, so we have C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, C7. At the very top of the piano, C8. So those are our octave numbers. That means anything in each of these brackets is going to be that note with that number. And it helps us keep things straight when we're referring to many different instruments and a wide range and talking about what each of those are. Quick little side bonus when we're talking about the alto clef. I talked about any of the C clefs are pointing to this note as middle C, which means that this is C4. And another name for this clef is the C clef, or very specifically, the C4 clef. So this one points to G4, this one points to C4, and this one points to F3. Which is interesting because they're all in a pretty small area of music. I mean, here's F, here's C, and here's G. They're not too far away from each other. But that's where most of the music making actually happens, in a fairly limited range, in a fairly middle range. Why do we have clefs at all? Well, if we didn't have these clefs and we were using these ranges beyond the 5-line staff, we'd be reading a whole lot of ledger lines. And no one loves reading a whole lot of ledger lines. I'm talking about sight reading something that's got 6 and 7 ledger lines on almost every note. That's not fun. That's not as fun and easy as it would be if we were on a staff. And so by showing different values for the 5-line staff, different letters and octaves that those lines correspond to, we can read music that's a lot easier to see, a lot easier to read, a lot easier to understand because there aren't nearly as many ledger lines. Also, certain instruments and voice parts get accustomed to reading in a specific range, and so this lets them read in that particular range. In the Renaissance and Baroque eras, they used a whole lot of the C clef, especially for vocal music. So vocalists only had to really learn what one clef did, but then they would move that clef around to all kinds of different places. And they would just read the clef from those spots. So that's an idea how all of these work. Obviously review this as much as you need in order to feel really comfortable with it.